Hey friends, Matt aka Martin here, and in this video I want to share with you a simple way to create cool and soothing ambient soundscapes and textures using a combination of synthesis, audio effects, and some of the new features in Ableton Live 12. Now, this can be done in any edition of Ableton Live 12 or even previous versions of Ableton Live, just minus a few features. So regardless of what edition you're using, whether that's Light, Intro, Standard, or Suite, you should be able to follow along in some way, shape, or form. Let's get to it. So to start with, we're going to use a synthesizer to create our bass sound, and the synthesizer I'm going to use for this is Drift. Here we've got Drift loaded up onto a basic MIDI track, and we're just going to create a really simple kind of evolving pad sound using the synthesizer. Just so we can hear the output of the sound, I'm going to engage the computer MIDI keyboard with the M key, and now I can use my computer keyboard to effectively play this synthesizer when the track is armed. Let's go ahead and create something a little bit more slow moving and subdued. So I'm going to increase the release here of the first envelope, increase the attack, increase the decay as well. And we're also going to reduce the filter frequency of the low pass filter here in the filter section. Let's go ahead and change the unison mode here to stereo and increase the unison amount. And let's just increase the drift subtly as well. Now I'm going to go ahead and introduce the second oscillator, which by default might already be on for you. So we can just introduce the level of oscillator 2 a little bit. I'm actually going to change the settings here. Let's go to oscillator 2, change this to this third wave here, change the octave up, and just detune it slightly from oscillator 1. Let's go ahead and add a little bit of noise. And now I'm going to increase the high pass filter here as well to remove some of those low frequencies. Next, let's add a little bit of movement to this sound by using the envelope and LFO. So let's go ahead and use the envelope 2 here to modulate the low pass filter frequency. So let's change our frequency mod to envelope 2, pull the frequency down a little bit, and increase the depth amount here. Now let's again make this envelope a little bit more slow moving. So let's increase the release, decrease the sustain, increase the decay, and increase the attack a little bit as well. Let's pull down this filter frequency even further, increase the filter frequency mod, and now let's go ahead to the LFO and change this to something like Wander, so that it's a bit more of a random moving LFO, and assign the LFO here to control, say, the shape of oscillator 1. So let's go ahead and select this drop-down menu, LFO, and increase the percentage amount here so that this shape just kind of moves up and down along with the LFO. Let's pull down the filter frequency modulation from envelope 2 a little bit. And lastly, what I want to do is add the ability for velocity to control certain parameters in this, namely the filter frequency. So let's go ahead and change this second drop-down menu here from LFO to velocity, and then increase the depth or the amount that the velocity is controlling the filter frequency of that low pass filter, so that a higher velocity opens up the filter more and a lower velocity lowers the filter a little bit more. So let's increase this. And as I play a lower velocity, you'll hear the filter is much more closed, versus with a higher velocity, the filter is much more open. And this is going to be really good when we start to apply some randomization to the MIDI that we're going to use to generate this kind of more ambient soundscape pad sound. Now we have our bass sound. Let's go ahead and add some effects to really give this sound a little bit more space and airiness. First, I'm going to go ahead and use an EQ. Just to keep this applicable for all versions of Ableton Live, I'm going to use the channel EQ. And so here with this channel EQ, I'm actually just going to reduce the low frequencies a little bit and reduce the high frequencies a little bit. And let's reduce the velocity slightly. And let's pull down the mid frequencies kind of in this 1K or so range. Next, let's go ahead and add some delay and some reverb to really open up this sound. I'm gonna go ahead and just add a simple delay here. Let's reduce the level of the dry wet, increase the level of the feedback, and let's also offset the left and the right sides to give this a little bit more stereo width. So let's offset the right side plus kind of 0.7% and the left side minus about the same. We can also reduce the level of the filter of this delay to just constrain the range, the frequency range of the delayed sounds. Now let's go ahead and add some reverb. Let's increase the dry wet of the reverb a little bit and increase the decay. And we could play around with some other parameters here too, such as the size, maybe change the balance of the diffusion to the reflection, and even play around with things like the input filter, the pre-delay, and maybe some of this diffusion network as well. If you don't know what's going on with all these different parameters, I've got a whole video that goes through all of the different aspects of Ableton Live's reverb, which you can check out with the card above. So now that we've got this initial sound, what we're gonna go ahead and do is generate some kind of MIDI pattern to actually play this sound. Now for this, we're gonna use the new MIDI tools that are available in Live 12 Standard and Suite. If you only have Light or Intro, you can still do a similar thing, but you just have to click in some notes randomly instead, and I'll also show you how to do that. So for this, in our arrangement view, let's go ahead and create one 8-bar long MIDI clip by selecting 8 bars and pressing the keyboard Command Shift and M or Control Shift and M on Windows to create a MIDI clip. Next, what we need to do is select the scale that we want to work with. I'm gonna go ahead and down in my scale section in the clip, we're gonna select a root note of maybe say F. And instead of being in either major or minor or one of the other kind of scales here, I'm actually going to select either major or minor pentatonic so that we don't have as much dissonance when we're generating these different notes that are going to be played back in this sound. For the sake of this, let's go ahead and choose major pentatonic, and that's going to remove all of the semitone relationships here in this scale, which again reduces the possibility of those kind of dissonant sounds, which may or may not work depending on the vibe you're going for. So if you don't have Ableton Live 12 Standard or Suite, now what you're going to go ahead and do is fold the MIDI editor here to the scale that you selected by going up to the scale option in the top of the clip editor, or by pressing the G key on your keyboard, or Shift and G if you've got the MIDI computer keyboard enabled. And now what you can go ahead and do is just simply click in some random notes, maybe hold down Option or Alt or Control to click and drag and create some copies of these different notes to create some kind of random pattern that's going to be used to generate the sound that we're going to be hearing. Now, if you have Ableton Live 12 Standard or Suite, you'll have access to the new MIDI tools, including the new MIDI generators, which is what we're actually going to use to generate this pattern. So let's go ahead and press Command and A or Control and A to select all of these notes, and press Delete to delete them. Let's unfold the scale here, and let's go ahead and move over to our Generation tab, select the Seed tool, and now we can go ahead and just generate a random pattern by clicking on the Generate button. So that we can generate something a little bit more useful for this, I'm going to increase the size of my grid with Command or Control and 2 to maybe quarter notes. Then we're going to change the duration of the seed between, say, quarter notes and 1 bar long. We can adjust the velocity ranges here. And we can also set the range of the pitch by holding down the Alt or Option key and just clicking and dragging on the notes in the left-hand side of the MIDI editor. And I'm going to do this and select 2 octaves of F to F. Next, let's play around with the voices. Maybe go 2 voices, increase the density, regenerate the pattern a few times until we find something that we like. So after playing around with a few settings, I've landed on this, which I quite like. And now let's go ahead and randomize the velocity just a little bit more so that we can kind of play around with that velocity variation that we added to the synthesizer itself. So I can just select all of these notes, go down to the bottom here, and just play around with this randomize value right next to this randomize button. And I could even play around with the deviation a little bit too, until we get something that sounds kind of nice. Now, unfortunately with the seed tool, we can't actually generate anything longer than 1 bar. So what I actually want to do is stretch out these notes so that I can get a little bit more of a slow moving pattern. To do this, I'm going to go back to the Time and Utilities tab here, and I'm just going to select again all of the notes with Command and A, and we can use this stretch control here to just stretch the length of these notes to try and come up with something a little bit longer and more slow moving. Then we can actually increase the loop length of the clip. And once we've extended that loop length, we'll need to extend out the clip in the arrangement view as well, so that we can see the whole thing. Now what I'm going to do is play around with some MIDI effects to add a little bit more randomness to the notes that are going to be generated and then played through the synthesizer. To start with, what I'm actually going to do is add a random MIDI effect before this drift synthesizer. And now in Ableton Live 12, most of the pitch-based MIDI effects, such as random, can actually be locked to the scale of a currently playing clip on that track by clicking on the Use Current Scale button, which is just at the top on the device title bar. And so by turning this on, now when I increase the chance for this randomization, any random note that's generated is actually going to be generated within the key or within the scale that we're using in the clip. So let's increase the chance, change the sign here to by so that we can generate notes either above or below incoming notes, and just reduce the choices down to say 7 so that we're working within a single octave here. Next, I'm going to use the chord MIDI effect placed after the random MIDI effect, and we're going to use this to randomly generate some additional notes either an octave below or a fifth above any incoming notes. So to do this, once again, I'm going to go ahead and engage the Use Current Scale option. I'm going to set this first shift here to -7 scale degrees, which is a whole octave, and I'm going to set this second shift here to 4 scale degrees, which is a perfect fifth. And now in the new chord device in Ableton Live 12, I can go down to this chance option and just reduce the chance that one of these additional notes is going to be generated. You could play around with the different chance values here, or even play around with adding additional notes with the other shift controls. But for this, I'm just going to pull down the chance that a perfect fifth is generated and make that a little bit lower than the chance that an octave below is generated. Now let's clean up the initial sound a little bit by reducing the influence of the velocity over the filter frequency, just because I think it's a little bit too much. And you could go ahead and also add some further randomization using things like the expression control device to control aspects of the synthesizer too. But now let's go ahead and just add a little bit more movement to the sound with some further processing and a little bit more modulation. The first thing I'm going to do is add a phaser device, and I'm actually going to add this phaser between the EQ and the delay, just to add a little bit more movement to the sound before all of this space gets added. Let's pull down the amount, reduce the rate to make it a bit slower, reduce the dry wet, increase the feedback, and then just reduce the center frequency a little bit. If it's not already, you can also unfold the LFO tab here in the phaser flanger device and increase the phase to offset the phases of the left and right LFOs to give it a little bit more stereo width. Now we have pretty much the full sound. You can go ahead and adjust some further things, like maybe increase the high pass filter, decrease the filter frequency of the initial synthesizer, maybe play around with the rates of the envelopes a little bit. You could also play around with some of the effects and maybe increase the decay on the reverb, maybe increase the feedback on the delay. The possibilities here are really endless, and I encourage you to experiment and play around with adjusting the sound to your own liking. Now that we have this sound, we can actually take it further with a few different and cool techniques. For example, I'm just going to go ahead here and extend the length of this loop out to maybe 32 bars, and then I'm going to resample this to audio by freezing and flattening the MIDI track. Now, in Ableton Live 12, we can do this by simply right-clicking on the track and coming down to freeze and flatten track. If you're in a previous edition of Ableton Live, you'll have to freeze the track first and then flatten the track. Just so that we can keep access to our initial sound, I'm going to first duplicate the track with Command or Control and D, and then I'm going to freeze and flatten this duplicate of the track. Now let's go ahead and mute the initial track, and now we have the audio version of our ambient textural pad. From here, you could do things like reverse the sample by pressing the R key on your keyboard. You could duplicate the track and layer the reversed sample with the unreversed sample by again pressing the R key to just re-reverse the sound. You could go ahead and once again duplicate this track and maybe pitch this third version down one whole octave and change it to something like Complex Pro or even Tones Warp Mode. And heck, you could even duplicate this last track once again and just stretch it out to twice its length to create even more variation and interest, and then just balance the different tracks using the track volume controls to create these interesting, different, evolving textures and soundscapes. You could then go ahead and add some more reverb, some more delay, and you could even maybe take one of these audio samples, put it into a simpler, put it on slice mode, and create something a little bit more rhythmic or interesting like that. The possibilities really are endless once you've created this initial sound. If you come up with anything cool using this technique, please send it my way, share it with me. I'd love to hear what you make. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you all in the next video.